the quantum signal arrived at Terra Station. During the night shift, when most of the command staff were sleeping in their quarters and only a handful of technicians monitored the deep space communication arrays that stretched across half the solar system. Specialist Amy Carter was reviewing routine transmission logs when her console suddenly lit up with an emergency priority marker that she had never seen before in her 3 years of service. The message was fragmentary and corrupted by distance, but the desperation in it was impossible to miss. It came from the Valorian system, a place so far from human space that most people had never heard of it. Amy ran the translation software 3 times to make sure she understood correctly. The Quellans, a species of fragile insectoid people known for their peaceful nature and advanced mathematical abilities, were dying. Their planet was under attack, and they had been begging the Galactic Council for help for 3 months with no response beyond empty diplomatic promises. Their cities were burning, and their people were being hunted down by the Krathic Dominion, a militaristic empire of reptilian warriors who wanted the rare gravitonium deposits that lay beneath Valoria Prime. The Quellans had exhausted every official channel, and now they were sending out one last desperate transmission to anyone who might listen. Amy saved the message and immediately called her supervisor, who told her to wake up Admiral Greg Patterson regardless of the hour. The Admiral arrived in the communications center 15 minutes later, still wearing his sleep clothes under a hastily thrown-on jacket. He listened to the message twice without saying a word, and his face grew harder with each repetition. When it finished playing, he asked Amy how long it would take to verify the transmission. She told him it was already verified through 7 different authentication protocols. The Admiral nodded slowly and told her to assemble the senior command staff for an emergency meeting in 1 hour. The briefing room filled quickly as word spread through the station that something significant was happening. Commander Lisa Hayes arrived first, her uniform perfect despite the early hour. Lieutenant Kevin Brooks came next, the Marine commander still alert and ready despite being pulled from sleep. Dr. Helen Price rushed in carrying a medical tablet, already reading whatever information she could find about Quellan biology. Others followed until the room held every senior officer on the station. Admiral Patterson stood at the head of the conference table and played the Quellan message for everyone. The room fell silent as they listened to the desperate plea for help. When it ended, the Admiral pulled up tactical displays showing the Valorian system. 63 Krathic warships were in orbit around Valoria Prime. Orbital scans showed massive strip mining operations and entire cities reduced to rubble. The estimated Quellan death toll was already in the hundreds of thousands and rising every day. Commander Hayes studied the tactical display with professional intensity. She pointed out that the Krathic fleet outnumbered anything humanity could send by at least 5 to 1. The Krathic Dominion was an established military power that had conquered half a dozen systems. Their flagship, the Eternal Conquest, was a dreadnought-class vessel that matched anything in the human fleet. Lieutenant Brooks asked the obvious question that everyone was thinking. Why were the Quellans calling humanity for help instead of the Galactic Council? Admiral Patterson explained that they had been calling the Council for months, but the Council moved slowly, preferring diplomatic solutions and committee meetings to direct action. The Quellans had finally given up on official channels and sent out their message to anyone who might actually respond. Dr. Price spoke up and said that by her calculations, the Quellan population might not survive another month at the current rate of casualties. The debate that followed was brief, but intense. Some officers pointed out that humanity had no treaty obligations to the Quellans and no authority to intervene in that sector. Others noted that picking a fight with the Krathic Dominion could have serious diplomatic consequences. The Galactic Council would almost certainly object to unauthorized military intervention. Ambassador Thelron of the Severian Collective would file dozens of complaints citing interstellar law. There could be economic sanctions or political isolation. Admiral Patterson listened to all the arguments, and then he told them about his younger brother. 20 years ago, his brother had been part of a civilian convoy that was attacked by pirates in the Centauri sector. The convoy had sent out distress calls that were received by 3 different military forces, including a Galactic Council patrol. Every single one of those forces had declined to respond because the convoy was in disputed territory, and getting involved might cause diplomatic complications. By the time anyone finally decided to act, everyone in the convoy was dead. The Admiral had never forgotten that his brother died, while people who could have saved him debated jurisdiction and protocol. He looked around the table at his officers and told them that he refused to let that happen again. The Quellans had asked for help, and while the galaxy debated, humanity would act. Commander Hayes asked how long it would take to mobilize the Third Fleet. The Admiral told her she had 6 hours. The fleet would consist of 12 warships, including 3 Dreadnought-class vessels, led by the newest ship in the human navy, the UHS Retribution, under Commander Hayes' personal command. 5 heavy cruisers would provide fire support, and 4 rapid response frigates would handle pursuit and reconnaissance. Dr. Price immediately requested permission to join the mission with a full medical team. The Admiral approved her request and told her to prepare for mass casualty treatment of an alien species they had limited medical knowledge about. Lieutenant Brooks began organizing his Marine detachment for possible ground operations. They would drill constantly during the 2-week journey to Valoria, preparing for urban combat in an alien environment against an enemy that had already proven their willingness to target civilians. Specialist Amy Carter was assigned as the primary communications officer for the mission. Her job would be to establish contact with any surviving Quellan forces and coordinate relief efforts once the military situation was resolved. The mobilization began immediately, and Terra Station transformed into organized chaos as supplies were loaded, crews were briefed, and ships prepared for immediate departure. The news spread quickly through the fleet, and every human who heard it understood what was happening. They were going to war without council approval, without official sanction, without any certainty of success. They were going because it was right. 6 hours after the Quellan message arrived, the Third Fleet began departure procedures. 12 warships undocked from Terra Station and formed up in departure formation. Their slipspace drives charged up, creating shimmering distortions in normal space that most alien species considered dangerously unstable, but which humans had mastered through years of risky testing. On the bridge of the UHS Retribution, Commander Hayes ran final systems checks while Admiral Patterson broadcast a message to the entire fleet. He told them they were heading into a situation where they were outnumbered and outgunned by an enemy that had never lost a major engagement. He told them the Galactic Council would condemn their actions, and there might be diplomatic consequences that lasted for years. He told them that none of that mattered because somewhere out there, people were dying while the galaxy looked away. Humanity remembered what it was like to be ignored when you needed help most. Today they would be the answer that someone else was desperately waiting for. The fleet engaged their slipspace drives and vanished from Terra Station sensors, beginning the 2-week journey to Valoria. Behind them, Ambassador Thelrin was already composing his first diplomatic protest. Ahead of them, the Quellans were still dying, and the Krathic were still confident that no one would challenge them. Neither the ambassador nor the Krathic understood yet that humanity did not make empty gestures. When humans said they were coming, they meant it. The 2-week journey to Valoria felt longer than any voyage Commander Lisa Hayes had ever experienced, despite the fact that their slipspace drives cut the normal travel time by more than half. Every day brought new intelligence reports from long-range sensors as they got closer to their destination, and every report made the situation look worse. The Krathic had established complete orbital control and were methodically destroying anything that could be considered military infrastructure, even though the Quellans had no real military to speak of. Lieutenant Kevin Brooks spent the entire journey drilling his Marines in urban combat scenarios adapted for alien environments. His troops practiced breaching techniques in mock-ups of Quellan architecture that the computer had generated from orbital images. They rehearsed precision shooting drills because the Krathic were using civilians as shields, and the Marines could not afford to miss. Brooks ran the same scenarios over and over until his people could execute them perfectly even when exhausted and stressed. Dr. Helen Price worked day and night, studying everything humanity knew about Quellan biology, which turned out to be very little. The Quellans were insectoid with exoskeletons made of a calcium compound that was stronger than human bone but also more brittle. Their internal organs were arranged completely differently from mammals, and their blood used a copper-based compound instead of iron, which meant it was blue instead of red. Price prepared her medical teams for injuries they had never treated before, in species they had never examined. She created treatment protocols based on educated guesses and hoped desperately that she would not have to watch patients die while she figured out the right procedures. Specialist Amy Carter spent her time learning the Quellan language from the fragmentary recordings they had received. The language was musical and complex with harmonics that human vocal cords could not quite reproduce. but she practiced until she could at least make herself understood. She established protocols for emergency communication, knowing that when they arrived there might not be time for careful translation. On the bridge of the Retribution, Admiral Greg Patterson studied tactical simulations with Commander Hayes. They ran hundreds of battle scenarios through the combat computer, trying to find any way to overcome the 5-to-1 numerical disadvantage they faced. Human ships were built differently from most species because they had to be strong enough to operate in Earth's gravity well and survive in an atmosphere that was mildly corrosive to many aliens. Human weapons hit harder because humans had evolved hunting megafauna that could kill them easily. Human engines could accelerate faster because human bodies and properly designed acceleration couches could survive forces that would kill most other species. These advantages might matter, but they still faced 63 enemy ships, including the massive Eternal Conquest. Hayes proposed a strategy that relied on speed and maneuverability, rather than trying to match the Krathic in a straight firepower exchange. Patterson approved the plan, knowing it was risky, but seeing no better alternative. Meanwhile, back in Council space, Ambassador Thelrun was making quite sure that everyone knew about humanity's unauthorized military action. He filed formal complaints with the Galactic Council, citing at least 37 different interstellar laws about military intervention. He gave speeches about the dangers of allowing primitive species to engage in vigilante justice. He warned that if humanity was allowed to act unilaterally, then the entire structure of galactic civilization would collapse into chaos. Many council members agreed with him, especially the ones from powerful military species, who did not want smaller powers thinking they could solve problems with force. But something unexpected was happening in the halls and chambers where minor species gathered. These were the peoples who had no council seats and no military strength of their own. They had sent their own desperate pleas for help over the centuries, and watched those pleas get lost in committee meetings and diplomatic procedures. They heard about the human fleet racing toward Valoria, and they saw something the council feared. Here was a power willing to act on principle rather than politics. Messages of support began arriving at Terra Station by the dozens from species most humans had never heard of. The Third Fleet emerged from slipspace at the edge of the Valorian system, exactly 2 weeks after leaving Terra Station. The tactical displays immediately filled with contact markers as their sensors picked up the Krathic fleet. 63 warships, just as the intelligence had reported, arranged in a defensive formation around Valoria Prime. Commander Hayes studied the formation and noted that the Krathic clearly did not expect any real opposition. Their ships were positioned for orbital bombardment and ground support, not for fleet combat. Specialist Carter immediately began broadcasting on all Quellan frequencies, trying to establish contact with survivors. For several long minutes there was no response, and Hayes wondered if they had arrived too late. Then a weak signal came through from somewhere, in the northern mountains of Valoria Prime. An elderly Quellan who identified himself as Counselor Vexith responded in halting but understandable standard galactic language. He sounded shocked that anyone had actually come. He said the council had told them no one would respond because intervening would violate too many regulations. Carter told him that humans did not come because of regulations, but because it was the right thing to do. She asked for tactical information about Krathic positions on the ground, and Vexith provided what intelligence his scattered people had been able to gather. The Krathic had fortified positions around the 3 remaining Quellan population centers, and were using the civilians as shields while they continued their mining operations. Admiral Patterson listened to the reports and felt his anger growing colder and more focused. He had seen this pattern before. Predators who preyed on the helpless always assumed no one would stop them. The Admiral opened a channel on all frequencies, broadcasting in every major galactic language. His message was directed at the Krathic forces, but he knew it would be heard across half the sector. He identified himself as commander of the human Third Fleet and stated clearly that the Quellan people had asked for help. Their request had been denied by those who should have protected them. Humanity was not here to negotiate or find diplomatic solutions. They were here to ensure that those who preyed on the helpless understood there were consequences. The Krathic had 12 hours to evacuate the system. Anyone remaining after that deadline would be considered a hostile combatant. This was their only warning. The response came quickly from the Krathic flagship. War Leader Thraxus broadcast his reply with obvious amusement and contempt in his voice. The Krathic Dominion had been conquering systems for 3 generations. They did not evacuate and they did not negotiate with inferior species. Humans were barely a century into space travel, and they dared to threaten the Krathic. His message ended with a simple challenge to come and die. Admiral Patterson had expected exactly that response, and he used the 12 hours well. Commander Hayes positioned the fleet in what looked like a defensive formation to Krathic sensors, but was actually designed to channel enemy ships into carefully prepared kill zones. Her tactical plan relied on exploiting human advantages in acceleration and weapons power. Lieutenant Brooks prepared his Marines for immediate deployment once the space battle was resolved. Dr. Price set up field hospitals on the UHS Sanctuary, which would remain in the rear area treating casualties. Specialist Carter maintained constant communication with Counselor Vexith and the other scattered Quellan survivors, letting them know that help had finally arrived. When the 12-hour deadline expired, the Krathic fleet began advancing confidently toward the human formation. They had fought dozens of species and conquered half a dozen systems. Their ships were heavily armored and their weapons were powerful. What they did not understand was that human vessels operated on completely different design principles. Where most species built ships to survive in the relatively gentle conditions of space, human ships were built to withstand the crushing gravity of Earth and the corrosive nature of its atmosphere. Human engines were overpowered by alien standards because Earth's deep gravity well demanded it. Human weapons fired solid projectiles at relativistic speeds because humans had learned to hunt by bringing down creatures much larger than themselves. War leader Thraxus was about to receive an education in what it meant to fight a species from a death world, and the tuition would be paid in blood and burning ships. The Battle of Valoria began exactly 12 hours after Admiral Patterson's deadline with the Krathic fleet, advancing in standard attack formation toward the human ships. War leader Thraxus commanded from his flagship, and his confidence was visible in every tactical decision he made. The Krathic had numerical superiority and centuries of military tradition. They expected the humans to either flee or die quickly. Commander Lisa Hayes watched the enemy approach on her tactical display and waited for exactly the right moment. The Krathic crossed into range and opened fire with their energy weapons, bright lances of coherent light that could burn through most ship armor given enough time. The human shields absorbed the first volley while Hayes counted down the seconds. When the range closed to optimal distance, she gave the order to return fire. The UHS Retribution's main railguns fired solid tungsten projectiles accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. The kinetic energy in those rounds was devastating. Where Krathic energy weapons took time to burn through armor, human railguns simply punched through shields and hulls like they were not there. The first 3 Krathic cruisers died in the opening salvo, their hulls torn open by impacts that released more energy than most planetary bombardment weapons. Thraxus saw his ships exploding on his display, and for the first time in his long military career, he felt something close to doubt. The human weapons were far more powerful than intelligence had suggested. He ordered his fleet to press the attack and use their superior numbers to overwhelm the enemy. The Krathic formation shifted to surround the human fleet from multiple angles, which was exactly what Admiral Patterson wanted. He gave a simple order to all ships, and the human fleet suddenly accelerated at rates that would kill most organic species through pure gravitational force. Human crews in their acceleration couches and combat suits barely noticed the crushing pressure as their ships pushed past 10 gravities of acceleration. The Krathic tried to match the maneuver, but their ships were not built for such violent movement and their crews could not survive it. The human fleet cut through the Krathic formation like a blade, firing as they went. The space between the two forces filled with debris and burning atmosphere as ship after ship died. Commander Hayes executed the maneuver that would later become famous throughout human space. She brought the Retribution to full acceleration directly toward the Krathic flagship, building up tremendous velocity. The Krathic assumed she was attempting a ramming attack which would destroy both ships. They concentrated their fire on the Retribution, trying to stop it before impact. The human dreadnought's shields flared bright under the intense bombardment but held. At the last possible moment, Hayes cut the engines and fired maneuvering thrusters to flip the ship end over end while maintaining forward momentum. The Retribution was now traveling backward at tremendous speed directly toward the Eternal Conquest. Hayes unleashed every weapon on her ship in a full broadside at point-blank range. Railgun rounds tore through the Krathic flagship's shields and armor. Missile pods fired their entire payload in a single devastating salvo, Energy weapons that humans had adapted from captured alien technology added their fire to the barrage. The Eternal Conquest tried to return fire, but Hayes had positioned her ship perfectly. The Krathic weapons could not angle properly to hit a target that was essentially underneath them. The massive flagship broke in half under the concentrated fire, its reactor containment failing in a brief sun-bright explosion that lit up the battlefield. War leader Thraxus died, still not understanding how he had lost. While the space battle raged in orbit, Lieutenant Kevin Brooks and his Marines were already descending to the surface in armored dropships. The Krathic ground forces had established fortified positions around the remaining Quellan cities and were using the civilians as living shields. Brooks studied the tactical display during the descent and felt his jaw tighten. The Krathic positions were well designed, and taking them by conventional assault would cause massive civilian casualties. He divided his forces into small teams and assigned each one a specific target. The dropships came in low and fast, using the chaos of the orbital battle to mask their approach. They landed in the ruins outside the cities, and the Marines moved out immediately. Brooks led the first team personally toward a Krathic command post that was positioned in what had been a Quellan residential district. The Krathic had herded hundreds of Kellan civilians into the buildings around their position, knowing that any attacker would have to fire through innocents to reach them. The Marines approached using ruins for cover and moving with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had trained for exactly this scenario. Sergeant Danny Cooper and his sniper team found positions in the wreckage of a tall building that overlooked the Krathic position. Cooper was carrying a rifle designed for long-range precision work in Earth's gravity and atmosphere. The weapon was absurdly overpowered for use on most planets, but here on Valoria, where the gravity was lighter and the atmosphere thinner, it gave him incredible range and accuracy. He studied the Krathic position through his scope and identified firing solutions that would take out key targets without hitting any Quellan civilians. It required shooting through gaps in cover no more than a few centimeters wide, at ranges that most alien snipers would consider impossible. Cooper had been making shots like this since basic training. He fired, and a Krathic officer dropped dead with a tungsten round through his head. The other Krathic scrambled for better cover, but Cooper and his team were already tracking their next targets. Every shot was perfect. Every target died without a single civilian casualty. Brooks and his assault team used the confusion to breach the Krathic perimeter. They came in fast, using powered armor that enhanced their already considerable strength. The armor made each Marine effectively a walking tank, capable of shrugging off small arms fire and delivering devastating force in close combat. The Krathic tried to form a defensive line, but the humans were simply too fast and too aggressive. One Krathic warrior stood his ground and engaged Brooks in hand-to-hand combat when his weapon ran empty. The reptilian was half again as large as Brooks and far stronger in raw physical terms. But Brooks had grown up on Earth where everything wanted to kill you, and the only way to survive was to be meaner and more desperate than whatever was trying to eat you. He fought with techniques developed over thousands of years of human warfare. He used his armor's strength enhancement to match the Krathic's power, and his smaller size to be more agile. When the Krathic tried to use his superior reach, Brooks got inside his guard. When the Krathic tried to grapple, Brooks used leverage and joint locks that the alien's anatomy was not designed to counter. The fight lasted less than a minute and ended with the Krathic warrior dead and Brooks moving on to the next target. Similar scenes played out across all three cities as Marine teams eliminated Krathic positions with surgical precision. The Krathic ground forces had been expecting either no resistance or clumsy attacks that they could easily repel, while using civilians as shields. They were not prepared for an enemy that could make impossible shots through gaps in cover, or soldiers that moved through urban terrain like they owned it. The space battle lasted 4 hours, and by the end 40 Krathic ships were destroyed or disabled. The human fleet had taken damage but remained combat effective. The surviving Krathic vessels attempted to retreat. Admiral Patterson faced a decision. He could let them go and claim victory. The immediate threat to Valoria was ended. But he thought about the burned cities and the mass graves and the desperate plea that had brought them here in the first place. These Krathic had come to Valoria to murder innocents and strip the planet bare. They did not deserve to escape and tell stories about their adventure. Patterson gave the order that would later cause considerable controversy in diplomatic circles. No Krathic vessels were to be allowed to reach their home territory. The human frigates, faster and more maneuverable than anything the Krathic had, pursued the fleeing ships. It was not a battle, but an execution. Each Krathic ship was hunted down methodically and destroyed. When it was over, not a single Krathic vessel remained operational in the Valorian system. On the ground, the last Krathic position fell as the sun was setting over Valoria Prime. Lieutenant Brooks stood in what had been the central command post and looked at the freed Quellan civilians. They stared at the humans with their large compound eyes, still not quite believing they had been saved. One young Quellan approached Brooks hesitantly and touched his armored hand with one delicate limb. The child made a sound that the translator rendered as a simple thank you. Brooks felt something tight in his chest ease just slightly. This was why they had come. This moment right here was worth every risk they had taken. In orbit, Commander Hayes began coordinating relief operations while damage control teams worked on the human ships. Dr. Price and her medical staff were already on the surface treating Quellan casualties. Specialist Carter was establishing communication networks to help coordinate the massive humanitarian effort that would be needed. Admiral Patterson broadcast a message to the scattered Quellan survivors telling them it was over. They were safe now. Help had finally arrived. On the bridge of this human sea, the morning after the battle, Dr. Helen Price stood in what remained of a Quellan hospital and felt overwhelmed by the scale of suffering she was witnessing. Hundreds of injured Quellans lay on makeshift beds waiting for treatment, and her medical teams were working as fast as they could, but it was not nearly fast enough. The Quellan physiology was different enough from anything human doctors had trained for that every procedure required careful adaptation. Price had lost 2 patients already because she had guessed wrong about their biology, and those deaths haunted her, even as she moved on to the next patient who needed her help. The human medical teams worked alongside Quellan doctors who had somehow survived the occupation, and together they developed treatment protocols that actually worked. Price discovered that Quellan metabolism responded well to certain human medications once the dosage was adjusted for their smaller body mass. She found that their exoskeletons would regenerate if given proper nutritional support. Slowly and painfully she learned how to save them, and each life saved felt like a small victory against the darkness of what had been done to this world. Commander Lisa Hayes spent the first day after the battle, coordinating relief operations from the damaged Retribution. The human fleet had taken casualties too, and 23 humans had died in the fighting. 2 ships were so heavily damaged they would require months of repairs. But the fleet remained operational, and Hayes used every resource she had to help the Quellans. Engineers from the human ships came down to the surface and began clearing rubble and restoring basic infrastructure. They worked alongside Quellan workers and discovered that despite their physical fragility, the Quellans were incredibly skilled at complex tasks that required precision and patience. Lieutenant Kevin Brooks walked through the ruins of what had been Valoria's capital city and tried to comprehend the scale of destruction. Entire city blocks were nothing but rubble. Bodies lay in the streets where they had fallen. The Krathic had been systematic in their cruelty. Brooks and his Marines began the grim task of recovering the dead and helping survivors find their families. One of his men, Sergeant Danny Cooper, organized groups of Marines to dig through collapsed buildings looking for survivors. They found a few trapped in basements and shelters where they had hidden during the worst of the bombardment. Each rescue felt like a miracle. Specialist Amy Carter became the primary liaison between humans and Quellans. Her ability to speak their language, however imperfectly, made her invaluable. She spent long hours with Counselor Vexith learning about Quellan culture and explaining human intentions. The elderly Quellan still seemed shocked that anyone had actually responded to their plea. He told Carter that the Galactic Council had assured them repeatedly that help was coming, but months passed with nothing but more meetings and more delays. By the time they gave up on official channels, most of their civilization was already destroyed. Vexith arranged for Carter to meet with other surviving Quellan leaders, and together they began planning how to rebuild their world. 3 days after the battle, Counselor Vexith met Admiral Greg Patterson in person for the first time. The meeting took place in a tent that had been set up as a temporary command center. Vexith entered slowly, his movements stiff because his exoskeleton had been cracked during weeks of hiding in the mountains. He was old even by Quellan standards, and the suffering of his people showed in every line of his frame. Patterson stood when the counselor entered and then did something that surprised everyone present. He knelt down so that he could meet the smaller alien at eye level. Vexith looked at the human admiral with compound eyes that reflected the light in strange patterns. His translator rendered his words in standard galactic language. He asked the question that had been bothering him since the humans arrived. Why would they do this? Humanity owed the Quellans nothing. They had no treaty obligations and no economic interests in this sector. The Galactic Council had made it clear that intervention was not appropriate. So why had humans crossed half the galaxy to fight for strangers? Patterson's answer was simple and honest. He told Vexith that humanity remembered what it was like to call for help and hear only silence. They remembered being the ones who suffered while others debated and delayed. When they finally had the strength to make a difference, they swore they would be the answer that someone else was waiting for. Vexith was quiet for a long moment, and then he reached out with one delicate limb and touched Patterson's hand. The gesture needed no translation. Meanwhile, back in council space, the political situation was becoming complicated. Ambassador Thelrin was making speeches about human aggression and the breakdown of interstellar law. The Severian Collective and several other major powers demanded that humanity be sanctioned for their unauthorized military action. They argued that allowing such behavior would destabilize the entire galactic order. But something unexpected was happening in the lower chambers and outer halls where minor species gathered. The species without military power or council seats were sending messages of support to humanity. They had watched their own people suffer while the council debated, and now they saw in humanity something the major powers feared. Here was a species willing to act on principle even when it was politically inconvenient. Messages arrived at Terra Station from dozens of minor species asking if humanity would help them too, if they needed it. The question was beginning to reshape galactic politics in ways no one had anticipated. The Human Defense Council on Earth found itself in an awkward position. They had not authorized the Third Fleet's mission, and now they were dealing with the diplomatic consequences. President Nicole Turner called a meeting with her advisors to discuss how to respond to the Galactic Council's demands. Some argued that humanity should apologize and promise not to act unilaterally again. Others insisted that backing down now would make them look weak. Turner listened to all the arguments, and then she made a decision that defined human foreign policy for the next generation. When Ambassador Thelrin arrived at Earth to present his list of demands and violations, Turner met with him personally. The meeting was brief. Thelrin presented his prepared speech about interstellar law and the necessity of sanctions. He expected negotiation, or at least an attempt to minimize the damage. Instead, Turner gave him a response that was recorded and would later be played in every diplomatic hall in the galaxy. She told him that the Galactic Council had months to act, and they chose committee meetings over lives. Humanity chose differently. If acting to save innocent lives was a crime, then humanity would accept that judgment. But the Council should ask itself whether it could live with what it had failed to do. Thelrin had no response to that. His delegation left Earth without achieving any of their objectives. Back on Valoria Prime, the work of rebuilding continued. Human engineers helped the Quellans design new defensive systems so they would never be helpless again. Lieutenant Brooks volunteered to stay behind and train Quellan security forces. Not to turn them into warriors, but to give them the knowledge they needed to protect themselves. Dr. Price established a medical exchange program where human and Quellan doctors could learn from each other. Specialist Carter worked on creating lasting communication networks between humanity and the Quellans. 4 weeks after the battle, Admiral Patterson attended a memorial service for the humans who had died fighting for Valoria. 23 names were read aloud as the Third Fleet stood at attention. Patterson spoke to the assembled crews and told them that every person who died had known what they were fighting for. They knew that somewhere in the galaxy there had to be someone willing to stand up for those who could not defend themselves. The Quellans held their own memorial service honoring both their own dead and the humans who had died defending them. They built a monument in their capital showing two figures, one Quellan and one human standing together. The inscription was simple and in both languages. They answered. Patterson stood before that monument as the sun set on Valoria Prime and felt the weight of what they had done. The political consequences were still unfolding. The Galactic Council was fracturing between those who condemned humanity and those who quietly admired them. The Krathic Dominion was in chaos as subject species they had conquered began to rebel, inspired by what had happened at Valoria. 17 minor species had already approached humanity with a proposal for a new kind of alliance. But all of that was future problems. Right now, Patterson looked at the Quellan children playing in streets that 4 weeks ago had been battlefields. He watched human and Quellan workers laboring side by side to rebuild what had been destroyed. He saw Dr. Price laughing with a Quellan doctor as they compared medical notes. He saw Brooks teaching young Quellans basic defensive tactics with infinite patience. He saw Carter sitting with a group of Quellan elders, all of them working together on reconstruction plans. This moment right here was what they had come for. The galaxy could debate laws and consequences all it wanted. Humanity had answered a cry for help and changed lives that mattered. Sometimes that was enough. 6 months after the Battle of Valoria, Commander Lisa Hayes stood on the bridge of the UHS Retribution and watched the planet turning slowly below her. The scars were still visible from orbit, but life had returned to the Quellan world in ways that seemed miraculous given what it had endured. 3 major cities had been rebuilt with human engineering assistance and Quellan mathematical precision, creating something beautiful that combined the best of both species' knowledge. New defensive satellites orbited the planet ready to warn of any future threats. Hayes had stayed in system as part of a rotating defense force that ensured the Quellans would never face attack alone again. She had become friends with many of the people she had helped save, and she found herself thinking of Valoria as something worth protecting, beyond just military duty. The proposal that changed everything arrived on a secure channel from 17 different species simultaneously. Each one was a minor power without council representation or significant military strength. They had watched what happened at Valoria, and they had a question for humanity. Would humans be willing to do for them what they had done for the Quellans? The question came with a proposal for something called the Compact of Free Worlds. The principles were elegantly simple. Member species would maintain complete sovereignty over their own affairs. Mutual defense would be mandatory, meaning if any member was attacked, all members would respond immediately. Most importantly, there would be no committee votes when someone called for help, only action. Admiral Greg Patterson was skeptical when he first read the proposal. Humanity barely had the resources to defend its own systems, let alone serve as protector for dozens of other species. He called a conference with his senior staff to discuss whether this was even possible. Lieutenant Amy Carter, recently promoted for her work on Valoria, made the counter-argument that changed his mind. She pointed out that humanity did not need to police the entire galaxy. They just needed to make predators think twice before attacking peaceful species. The Krathic Dominion had learned that lesson when they lost an entire fleet. Other aggressive powers would learn the same lesson if necessary. The goal was not conquest or control, but simply making sure that calling for help would be answered. Patterson thought about that for a long time. He remembered his brother dying while people who could have saved him debated jurisdiction. He thought about the Quellans who had spent 3 months begging the Galactic Council for help that never came. He looked at the 17 species who were asking humanity to stand with them. Finally, he made a decision that would define human foreign policy for generations. Humanity signed the Compact of Free Worlds and 17 species joined immediately. They were not the powerful ancient empires that dominated the Galactic Council. They were the victims, the ignored, the dismissed. But together they became something the galaxy had not seen before. A coalition based on principles rather than politics. A promise that calling for help would actually mean something. The Galactic Council watched the formation of the Compact with growing alarm. Ambassador Thelran argued that this new organization threatened the entire established order. He was right, but not in the way he thought. The Compact did not threaten galactic civilization. It threatened the comfortable assumption that minor species could be ignored when they asked for protection. The first real test of the Compact came 8 months after Valoria, when the Vraxian horde attacked the Delmar system. The Delmar were a peaceful aquatic species who had recently joined the Compact. The Vraxians were raiders who preyed on weak targets expecting easy plunder. They had done this dozens of times before, and no one had ever stopped them because the Galactic Council moved too slowly to respond to raids. This time was different. The attack triggered automatic Compact defense protocols. Within hours, 5 Compact vessels, including the Retribution, arrived in the Delmar system. Admiral Hayes, recently promoted after Patterson retired to become overall Compact commander, delivered a message that became legendary. She told the Vraxians they had picked the wrong target. The Delmar were under Compact protection. The raiders could leave immediately or learn what that meant. The Vraxians chose to attack. They learned. The engagement lasted 40 minutes, and when it was over, the Vraxian fleet was scattered wreckage and the survivors were fleeing at maximum speed. Word spread quickly through the raiding communities that operated in the border regions. The compact was not making empty threats. Species under their protection really were defended, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Raiding activity dropped by 70% in compact space within 6 months. Lieutenant Kevin Brooks retired from active Marine service but stayed in the compact as a training instructor. He spent his time teaching alien species the tactics and techniques that had worked on Valoria. He adapted human combat methods for different biologies and different ways of thinking. His students came from a dozen species, and they learned not just how to fight, but why they were fighting. Brooks told them that strength without purpose was just violence, but strength used to protect others was justice. Dr. Helen Price became Chief Medical Officer for the entire compact, overseeing a network of hospital ships ready to deploy anywhere help was needed. She saved thousands of lives over the next few years, working in conditions that would overwhelm most medical personnel. She trained doctors from every member species in techniques developed during the desperate weeks after Valoria. She built a medical corps that could respond to any crisis. Lieutenant Amy Carter became humanity's primary diplomatic liaison to compact members. Her ability to understand alien perspectives and translate them into terms humans could act on made her invaluable. She mediated disputes between member species who had very different cultures. She negotiated treaties that respected sovereignty while maintaining the core compact principles. She helped new species integrate into an organization that was growing faster than anyone had expected. Within 2 years, the compact included 30 species. Within 5 years, it had 73 members. It never replaced the Galactic Council and was never meant to. The Council still handled trade disputes and territorial negotiations. But the compact became something the galaxy desperately needed. It was a promise that predators would face consequences, and that peaceful species would not face threats alone. Admiral Patterson spent his later years training the next generation of compact commanders. He was older now, and the years showed in his face, but his eyes were still sharp and his principles were still firm. Sometimes younger officers would ask him if he regretted the decision to go to Valoria without authorization. Patterson would always give the same answer. They asked for help, and while the galaxy debated, humanity acted. He would make that same choice again without hesitation. 2 years after Valoria, Patterson returned to the planet for an anniversary ceremony. The Quellans had built a new capital that combined human structural engineering with Quellan aesthetic beauty. The result was stunning. At the ceremony, Counselor Vexith, now very old but still sharp, spoke to the assembled crowd. He talked about the day they thought they would die, how they had sent a message expecting silence, how instead they received an answer that changed their world and changed the galaxy. He said the humans taught them something the galaxy had forgotten, that there was a difference between maintaining peace and ensuring justice. That peace which ignored suffering was not really peace at all. Later that evening, Patterson stood at the monument to the fallen. Admiral Hayes joined him, and they stood together looking at the names carved in stone, both human and Quellan names side by side. Hayes asked if he thought they had done the right thing. She pointed out that the Galactic Council still resented the compact, that half the galaxy thought humanity was dangerous, that the other half thought they were naive idealists. Patterson looked at the thriving Quellan city, where children played safely in streets that 2 years ago had been battlefields. He thought about the 73 species in the compact who no longer faced threats alone. He remembered his brother who died while help debated whether to come. He thought about all the other calls for help that had been ignored over the centuries, all the suffering that could have been prevented if someone had just acted. He told Hayes that the galaxy wanted peace and humanity gave them something better. They gave them justice. They gave them the promise that crying for help would be answered. They proved that sometimes doing the right thing mattered more than following the rules. Hayes nodded slowly. She looked up at the stars where compact ships now patrolled, where the promise they answered was being kept every single day. The monument behind them caught the last light of the setting sun. Its simple inscription glowed briefly. They answered. Somewhere in compact space, a new distress call was being received. A mining colony was under attack. Pirates thought they had found an easy target. But this colony had joined the compact last month. Automatic defense protocols triggered. Ships began moving immediately. Help was already on the way. The galaxy was learning a new truth, that humanity and their allies in the compact meant what they said. that asking for help would be answered, that predators would face consequences, that the weak were no longer helpless. Two simple words had changed Ev.